Okay? All right. Where we left off, we were talking about, well, everything we talked about in the last session is well and good, but how do you do it? What are some of the change management strategies that are required if we are going to become a transformative, adaptive court in these times of scarcity and competition for scarce resources? So one of the things that I would like to begin our conversation, and believe me, now that we have a much smaller group, fortunately, we'll have a chance to do a lot more teamwork and individual work than we did before. So I think you'll find this interesting. Where we're going to go is we're going to talk about change management strategies, at least review some things that I've seen that work, and more importantly, share some mistakes that I've made along the way, twisting my ankle, stepping in potholes, trying to help the good courts in this country. And then I want to have a dialogue with you on what I think is the single greatest impediment to having a successful change management strategy. And that is not appreciating the way people in our team prefer to work, decide, see the world, see the problem, and communicate. And one of the mechanisms that I use is the Myers-Briggs inventory, and hopefully all of you took it and got your alpha score. If you didn't, it's going to be okay, because by the time I get through evaluating each one of the alpha letters in Myers-Briggs, you'll understand probably what you think you are. So we're going to start with change management strategies and end on understanding how cognitive preferences, as measured by the Myers-Briggs test, and I like to use Myers-Briggs because we've collected thousands of test scores from judges and court administrators around the country. So we have a general idea of what the score is and how you are different than the general population. And that has practical implications on how we do our work. So that's kind of where we're going to go this morning. And again, thank you for being here. In small groups, I want you to reflect upon a time in the last 20 years, whether it's, it could be as small and insignificant as migrating from WordPerfect to Word, or preparing for Y2K. Those of you might have been doing what I was doing back then, is getting ready for Y2K. Or it could be more dramatic change initiatives. I've helped some courts move to an entirely, for the first time, unified court system, which was extremely traumatic for the court and for the people in it. So anywhere along that continuum, I want you to think back about some of the change initiatives that your courts have been in. And I want you to list one or two. I've given you more space than that. But then I want you to recall, and not putting anyone on the spot, I would like for you to share, to the extent that you're safe and not embarrassed to do so with your colleagues, what some of your fears were associated with those change initiatives. Because this, and understanding this, in my mind, is the most important thing we can do in courts. And it's never talked about, or rarely talked about. And yet it is the 600-pound elephant in the room that impedes and mucks up all change initiatives, is not having this type of discussion. So I'm going to start right off the bat, and I'm going to give you 10 minutes because it's important. I want you to list some of those change initiatives, and then I want you to share what it was about that change initiative that you were fearful about. Okay? Any questions about this first assignment right out of the blocks? Okay? Please begin. All right, welcome back. I want to go to the safer of the two topics, for lack of a better term. I'd like to hear about some of the change initiatives, whether externally imposed or internally created, that you dealt with. But I got to add a caveat. I can't even talk about this subject. Now, I won't do it today, but I actually used Carla Smith's court down in New Orleans and with the Hurricane Katrina to spend a whole day on change management. Devastating changes. And I tell you, those folks down there, they're the heroes and heroines down there that really, Carl, tell me if I'm watching the wrong movie here or telling the wrong movie, but you all really re-engineered your courts from the ground up completely. Talking about re-engineering, they re-engineered, I think you all unified your court. You started working with collaboratively more so than ever. You re-engineered literally your court and your processes and everything. And they not only lived through it, but I think Carla and her former presiding judge would tell you if he were here that they would never go through it again, and it wasn't worth the cost and the devastation to people. But there was a silver lining that came out of that. But again, because of their deterrence, I mean, they were just absolutely not deterred at all at the charge at hand, and it's a remarkable American story, not just a remarkable court story. It's a remarkable human endeavor story. Hopefully, none of you have any changes like that come to that scope. But let's hear what you all had to say. What were some of the change initiatives? Please. Minnesota went through a new statewide
installation of a new statewide computer system, MinSys, Minnesota Court Information System. Some of the fears we had: would the work get done? Would it be as efficient as some of the prior programs that we had in place? Again, for staff, it was change, learning something new. Would there be redundancy with the program? Would it be reliable, or would there be things falling through the gaps? Because whenever you start a new program, there's always things that aren't perfect, and there's bugs that have to be worked out. That was one of the things we had. We also had like e-filing, which we're moving towards. Staff are concerned about losing jobs. The more efficient you think you're becoming, staff have those concerns. The quality of work, what happens when the system goes down? You have frustrated customers. And again, learning new processes and procedures. Staff are on information overload.
Great. Very comprehensive. And a lot to be fearful of if it doesn't work. Who else? Yes.
So we talked about, I've worked in Minnesota and in Orange County in California, and in both places did organizational restructure, which consisted of supervisors and managers, that level, stepping up into more of a leadership role, because in the past we had kind of, everyone was more task-oriented and lead worker rather than that, and actually put some time restrictions on it, 18 months to step up to the plate. And that sounds cruel, but we also created training programs, professional kind of what would it take for you to get there, and gave everybody that criteria on the onset, told them what to expect, even though that's difficult sometimes, and then helped individuals work towards that, with the idea, though, if you didn't meet to those, you could get demoted, or maybe this wasn't the right place for you to be working. And as you can imagine, what that kind of change creates amongst staff. I think, and we did talk about it, things like, that they were now going to have to be more responsible for performance evaluations, no skipping evaluations every year. You're part of the leadership team, so you have to manage your own budgets. You have to create your own priorities that match the strategic initiatives of the court, that kind of thing. In the end, I think most people felt rewarded by it. It pushed them to a place they didn't think they could go. And so it actually provided opportunities. And even those that got demoted or decided to leave the organization, I think for the most part felt in the end it was a good decision for them to make, because it was no longer the organization they wanted to work for. But it wasn't like they marched out the door mad and slammed the door or anything. So.
Well, I think those comments are really interesting in many regards, but one of which is that I'm hearing that you didn't use the word stagnation, but almost heard implicit in what you said that stagnation breeds stagnation. And sometimes if you go through the wall on the other end, you go, how did I do that? But it's a brand new energy and commitment to people's jobs. One of the things I used to do as a court manager is when I knew I had somebody on a team that maybe had been in the court for a long time and had a lot of talent, but they just seemed to be burnt out, I'd give them a really big challenge, something brand new, to kind of make them change a little bit. And more often than not always, but more often than not, it completely re-energized them, much like you were saying. What are some other projects and fears that you all discussed? Sure.
Long ago, in a different time, we actually built a new courthouse. And we had been in a building that had been repurposed from being a police headquarters building and a jail, and they put a court into it. So it wasn't particularly efficient. It was a limited jurisdiction court. So we're very excited. We're planning this new courthouse. We have great people coming in to help us understand our business processes and how to design adjacencies. And we're all excited. And I realized that my staff ain't there. And what I learned out of that process is that I'm a relatively fearless person. I'm the person who goes, why not? And I really had to step back and I had to learn about what other people fear. And it's not just a catch-all of fear of change. It's many, many different fears. So that experience, believe it or not, made me a more sensitive person. Not my strong suit.
Well, you're a perfect example of learning organization that we talked about earlier. You looked at the impact and evaluated after the fact and see what changes or modifications you can make if you can get those folks to work through that fear. Anybody else? Yeah.
Steve. I'm Steve. I'm from Minnesota here, Hennepin County. A number of the things that we came up with as a list were state court unification a number of years ago and consolidation of state funding for the courts. There were a number of fears during that time. Will we be worse off? Control? Will things be forced and dictated top-down? Will we continue local practices? Loss of benefits from people going to state benefits, dealing with the unknown. Then there's the e-court initiative, and there are people who just have a fear of technology, don't want to let go of the paper, hold on to it. The fear of failure, both at the individual level and fear of failure of the technology. What are we going to do if it doesn't work or if it breaks or goes down? We talked a little bit about MNCIS, which has already been talked about, our statewide case management system. The electronic recording project, where court reporters have been reassigned to administration and now listen to a number of courtrooms and digitally record them, and the fear of that, and judicial officers letting go of their staff. And then focus on pro se litigants has been an interesting one during this time period of limited budgets and less resources, because as we start to fight for those resources within the courts, starting to talk about, are we going to encourage pro se people and dictate resources there, and then step back and have that larger discussion about how is this really going to help the court and actually save resources in the long run. And then a pilot that we actually have in our court right now, which is using adjunct judicial officers. These are attorneys that are hearing uncontested matters in probate. which we were very concerned about stakeholder and customer feedback and the impact it would have on public trust and confidence, and seeing the time that it's freeing up for some of the judicial officers to hear more complex cases. That one's still in the works. It's still there, but there's fears, and just watching how people react to it, myself included, has been an interesting process.
Well, I'm hearing a thread common to everything that each of you said, and it's not uncommon, and that is every one of you talked at length in terms of your fears about what if it didn't work, what would the impact on the people you're serving. I think that's really laudatory, and that's typical, I think, of the folks in our institution and in the courts. But I want to make this a little bit more about you. There's a big difference between selfishness and self-interest, and I want to make sure that we spend time on talking about you and your folks that work with you, because again, this is the first and perhaps biggest obstacle impediment to being adaptive and transformative, and that is getting people to get over the hurdle of some of the fears, because some of those fears are real. And some of their fears are going to come to pass. But it's how we have that dialogue and frame it that allows us to get to a constructive, post-fearful dialogue, which we have to have before we re-engineer. Some of the things that I see with some of the projects that I've worked on, there was one New England state a couple of years ago that I worked with that when one of you mentioned reunification, I think it was you, Steve, and they announced that they were going to unify the court and get rid of municipal and county courts. And so after they made the announcement, they brought me in to work with all these courts to try to get over the fear. And they said, what's your approach? And I'm going to go, well, they weren't even talking about the fear. They go, how are you going to help us make this change initiative happen? And I go, first of all, we get everybody together and we talk about what they're scared about, because they're not going to hear anything if they are not given a chance to have a catharsis. It's going to be like the old cartoon of the dog in the cartoon where what does he hear when his master talk? It's blah, 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 bone, blah, blah, bone, 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 blah, blah, blah. You know. So all we can hear when we're fearful is blah, blah, blah. So we need to get over that hurdle. So how do we do it? Well, you've mentioned some of the fears. Security, obviously. Some of these folks, during major transitions, may lose their job. Comfort. I'm comfortable in my job. I don't want to do things differently. Because if I change, if I have to get out of my comfort zone, then I will no longer be seen as being competent. The afraid of being seen as not being valuable. Again, one of the 4 fears we talked about, rejection. People are not going to see me as being competent. I'm going to lose control. I need control. And when we talk about Myers-Briggs in just a few moments, the J's, and I'll explain what that means in a little while, but the J's in your work environment have a much higher need for control, structure, and closure than many of us do. So it threatens our sense of control. It can even threaten purpose. And this really goes to what we were talking about this morning. You notice how many hands went up when I asked y'all how many people have been in the court system 15 years or more? Good golly. Well, imagine those folks who've stayed with the court system have, I think, probably a unity of purpose in what their core values are as a person and what they do as serving folks in the court system. That can explode if that person in their comfort zone that they have control over and competency over is now threatened. It threatens their very purpose of being here. Many of us in the court system, it's when I just meet somebody on, let's say, in Salt Lake on the light rail, and I sit down, they'll go, oh, they get to know you on a long trip, and I can't talk about who I am without talking about courts, because I just can't think of myself in any other capacity other than a servant to the courts and being in the courts. So that sense of purpose can be challenged. Status, trust. When someone you've worked with for 20 years. Let's say you've been their supervisor for 15 years, and then all of a sudden you come in and say, Bill, Mary, guess what? You're no longer going to be doing what you're doing. We're completely reorganizing, and now you're going to have to start over and learn a whole new competence. And if you're not up to it, and I'm not saying this is how the conversation should go, but you might want to look going elsewhere. Those conversations are happening. That impacts trust. It's not something you can't overcome, but it will threaten trust. So all of those things in the air have to be talked about because we're going to talk about resistors in a moment. You can't overcome resistance unless you get to the root of the fears. These are the 4 fears that we all have. In fact, everything you mentioned here, yes, please.
I was just going to say it's interesting that you're talking about staff because when we went through the change initiative at Hennepin, we had a grad student come and develop a program to do change management, and we said we need to look at our employees, we need to study our employees, and he came back a couple weeks later after talking to people and said, you need to start with your managers and supervisors and have them identify what their issues are with change, because if they're not aware of what's going on within themselves, it trickles down to the people below them. So how do they manage change? And we need to make them really aware.
That's a great point. Absolutely. What is good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we're the ones that have to sell, for lack of a better term, the change, if we're honest with ourselves about what fears we have, and in that honest dialogue say, you know what, I'm scared. I maybe become a dinosaur with this. Or I'm worried that I'm not smart enough now to get the competence. That is a very positive step in helping begin erode the other fear and resistance when we're honest with ourselves. That's so well said. But these 4 fears, just about everything that you all mentioned goes to one of these. And I'll tell you a true story. This is back when I was practicing law. It was before I was a young man then, and I had my very first jury trial, and all the senior partners were there to watch, to evaluate me, to see how I did. Because if I didn't do well, I could, at best not be on the partner track, or at worst, I might be fired. The case had been postponed and postponed, and we've got a thing in Virginia called a non-suit, where the plaintiff can, without prejudice, say, oh, forget it, I'll refile it later. He did that, and he filed it again a couple of years later, so here I am with my very first jury trial. I'd done much more work than I needed to the very first trial. But the night before my very first jury trial, I opened up my trial notebook just to refresh my memory, and I realized that I had failed to renew all my discovery requests. So I'm sitting there in a boat without a paddle against one of the most notorious plaintiff's attorney in the Richmond, Virginia area, who was also the chair of the House Judicial Committee. So I'm sweating. I'll tell you immediately where I went. I said, okay. Fear of failure, obviously. That's pretty clear. I may fail. If I do poorly because of this oversight, my senior partners, my firm is going to reject me. And if that happens, I'm going to lose my job. My wife and I had just bought a house. My wife is going to leave me. It wasn't a legitimate fear, but to me it was legitimate and concrete. And then, if my wife leaves me, you know what? I don't care if I live or die. Now, I know you're going to think, man, no wonder you spent $10,000 on a shrink. You are one messed up head case. But remember, in immense times of change, we go to a very stressful place where we let our rational reptilian brain take over. Let me just make a comment about this. There's a part of the base of our brain, the amygdala, that serves no purpose in the world for us. It's like our appendix. but it's happened to be part of our brain. It's the one vestige that's left over from our reptilian days. All it senses is fear, thirst, hunger, and a desire to reproduce, but especially fear. And when we are under stress, i.e. through times of change, we know from brain studies that that part of the brain that controls fear or magnifies fear gets glowing orange. I mean, it gets going. And it overrides our rational thinking. We don't know that that's happening, but that's precisely what is happening. It is a physiological response to change and stress. So what I just described may sound idiotic and over the top, but it's not that different than some of the fears that our folks in courts go home with every night and wake up in the middle of the night with when confronted with major change initiatives. So what can we do about that? Well, one, have that conversation about what our business our courts really are in and what our preferred future is, that we have some control over where we want to go. Now, like in Carla's case, sometimes the change is externally imposed on us and we don't have any control. And in fact, I heard one of you all say in your conversations I was walking up and down is that I felt like I had no control. Being able to express the fact in your team, when you go back to your courts, that, I don't feel like I have any control. That itself gives the person a sense of control and help them reclaim some of the fear that might be completely irrational. So when we talk about getting over fears and having that honest conversation about from the top down, what are your fears? Get them out on the table is the first strategy, because you don't want to have all the reengineering talk, again, being heard as saying, blah, 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 fired, blah, 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 fired, blah, 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 lose my house, blah, 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 wife leave me, blah, 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 I might as well be dead. So what are some change management strategies that I think work? And I'm going to make this very practical and specific to courts. Again, I may not be right, it's just what I observe and just what I believe. The first thing is to understand where are the typical causes or most common causes for courts to meet the challenges, and notice this, opportunities. This does not have to be a completely negative discussion about fears and challenges and losses. It applies to seizing the opportunities, and courts are seizing opportunities out there because they are becoming more adaptive and flexible and innovative and collaborative and communicative. And now all of a sudden opportunities are coming to them rather than vice versa. So this applies for opportunities and also for challenges. So what are the typical causes? I'm going to suggest something to you that is going to sound so counterintuitive, but I promise you, to my core, I truly believe this is true through practical experience and through making mistakes and not appreciating this. Let me first tell you a true story. In Vietnam, as y'all may recall, some of us are old enough to remember it very, very, very well. In Vietnam, the North Vietnamese guerrilla warrior and their tactics befuddled us during the Tet Offensive. We had just pretty much marched through the entire country, bombed, softened them up, taken over villages with hardly, and in many cases, for a long time, hardly a fight, hardly any resistance at all. Hardly any resistance. Where are they? They're just going to let us into this village without a fight? Come on, what's going on? And then all hell broke loose. Out of nowhere, the Viet Cong, guerrilla warriors, came from tunnels, trees, bushes. They had been around us the entire time. The analogy is perfect for courts in times of change. Those guerrilla warriors are in your court. They are laying in wait. If you don't embrace the resistance, hear from them, flush them out, they will sabotage you every time. They will sabotage the change initiative, and they will sabotage you. So what do we do about that? In red, embrace resistance. I encourage you to do that, and we do that by starting off by having the conversation of fear. Having an honest conversation of, you know what? Your resistance, your objection, it may not win the day, but it's making me tweak our approach. You actually have something here that we hadn't thought about. But even if you don't agree with it, even if they don't generate a good idea, people will, again, as I said this morning, would rather be listened to and understood than agreed with. And by saying, look, I want to hear your objections. I want to hear your fears. Why, in your opinion, won't this work? Why is this bad for you first, before we even talk about why it's better for the people that are walking up the street that don't even know we exist? Embracing the resistance that way at least allows you to get it out in the open. It doesn't foment as much. And you're not going to get all resistors out, but you can get some of them by saying, we want to hear from you. What are your reactions? And then do not penalize people for speaking openly against it. And I mean listening to understand rather than to win the argument. Let them be heard. Embrace the resistance. Courts have failed to do that, but instead say and I have seen this several times, from the top of the court administration, say, here's what your opinion is, this is what we're going to do. There are so many resistors lying in wait. So embrace the resistance. It can actually be a good thing. Allowing complacency to prevail over urgency. We need to say over and over and over again why it's important. And I mean in concrete terms, not just to inspire, but I'm saying, here's what it's going to do, here are the measurable differences, and say it over and over and over again. And then say, and this is why it's urgent. And I'm not talking about like a Y2K urgent that was a drop-dead date, but I'm just saying this is why it's critically important to our function and values as an institution. Not communicating the vision. Had a conversation with an AOC not that long ago, and this AOC said, well, first question, true story, first question I go, and this actually goes to your comment beautifully about at the top. I said, okay, do you think the people out in the community understand what your vision is and what this change is? She goes, it's all I do is talk about this. I go, okay. You're probably not doing it enough. And she got quite angry with me. And she said, that's just, I couldn't do it anymore. I've done it all I can do every time. I go, let me ask you something. If I walk into may I have your permission to walk into one of your director's offices and ask him to explain to me what the vision is? Would you allow me to do that? She said, sure. I walked in, literally, it was like the first or second door at random. Said, hello, I'm here. I'd already had some talks with them anyway, so they knew who I was. I said, can you explain the vision? Well, it has something to do about just being more efficient, case delays. I know it has to do with that. I go, okay, that's good, thanks. Walked back to the OC, said that, and I said, this is a perfect example why we need to communicate the vision, and we need to do it over and over and over again. And when you think you've saturated the market with communicating the vision, you got to do it some more. And you got to tie it to the purpose of the court. Here's one of the most practical suggestions I can give to you, and that is create short wins. If for no other reason, you are going to have resistors that are saying, you know what, they can't do this. They'll never be able to pull this off. I'm just going to lay in wait, and then I'm going to laugh. And along the way, I'm going to try to sabotage it. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it doesn't work. And then you have other folks who are good folks, but they are just late adapters. They are the last people to adapt any change. If you said, Mary, we're going to give you a $1,000 raise just for the heck of it. Why don't you take the week off and you don't have to work the rest of the year? There are some late adapters and resistors that are going to say, I'll be damned. You are not. So they need to see that we are going to win. And I'm going to use a word that people think is pejorative. It's the word manipulate. They always think that's just a negative word. Manipulate can be a positive word. I encourage the court managers to create visible and easy short-term wins. And here's why. Because those folks who don't think this is going to succeed, when they start seeing a succession of even small successes, small wins, it builds inertia. It builds belief that you mean what you say and you're going to be able to pull it off. And that inertia is so important when you look at the court culture equilibrium. It could go either way. Either way. Those short wins, after they see a few visible, it kind of turns the tide. So you can fashion your own small wins. One example, and this is actually a big, heavy lift, but one example is, I think somebody here was mentioning a pilot project. Once you do a pilot project, even if it's a disastrous failure, but you say, here's what didn't work. Here's how we're going to tweak it. Or this was an incredible success. Either way, it builds momentum. But you can do much smaller things, like a demonstration of a new IT app in like a 1-hour training to show that it doesn't take that much training to learn it and it saves time. Small things like that. Build and create short-term wins. Failing to cement changes into the court culture is another common example of why and how courts don't take advantage of opportunities or get the change initiative rolling. If people believe that in the values behind not only our court, but those values are consistent with what this change initiative is, they will have commitment. Because when we add value to who we are through our work and can tie it to our personal values, consistent with the court values, it overcomes so much. But it's got to be tied to our court culture. So what do? Get rid of obstacles. I'm going to give you a perfect example. I had this very conversation with Judge in, it may have been 2 or 3 years ago. And this whole change initiative, it kept coming back to this one person who actually was fairly low in the court system that was just the fly in the ointment. Talking about sabotaging, this woman had defined corporate guerrilla warfare to an art. And so the entire court was spending 90% of their time for 1% of their court population. And I see that over and over. Don't spend 90% of your time with 10% of the people that are screwing up. It doesn't make, to me, any organizational sense. But I know you want to. It's hard not to. I know it's easy for me to say it. Get rid of the obstacles. She goes, finally, the judge says, well, so I can't fire her. She's union. I go, well, you can still fire her. If she's union, maybe take a few more paper clips and telephone calls, but you can do that. But let's just say you don't want to. That's a legitimate answer. Say you just can't fool with it. Then sequester her. When you see a bad apple in a crate of apples going bad, you don't leave it there. You pick it up and you sequester it. So I said, don't allow that cancer to contaminate the rest of your group. Give her a new job assignment. Put her in a closet, with the light. Whatever you do creatively, but sequester this person. Get rid of the obstacles. I talked about create short-term wins. I won't go over that. I talked about cementing change into the culture, showing that you mean it, and you talk it, and you walk it. And it's visibly demonstrated by the leadership all the way down. And then lastly, connect and reward new behaviors. Now, that sounds real easy, doesn't it, these time of days? Most of us don't have any money to be giving our employees additional money. But we can reward in other ways. We can acknowledge publicly what they've done, their contribution, through awards or your court newsletter or the newspaper. There are a million ways sitting under your nose that we can't even enumerate here how you can creatively create a reward for new behaviors. So if we can avoid those obstacles, if we can talk about the fears, if we can just institute those first few things, the small is just building small wins up front, you will begin to see the inertia change and the wave come to your side. So before I move on to what I think is the number one impediment, not appreciating the value of the way we prefer to work cognitively, questions, comments, objections, disagreements on what we've talked about so far? Yes?
Just a comment on the reward. I am finding that some of the things that you mentioned in the younger workforce that we now have working for us, they don't care if their name's in the newsletter. They don't care to be praised in public. And when I say they don't care, it's not that's not important to them. So I wanted to raise that I do think in that regard we have to be a little bit more sensitive and creative in how we do that. And one thing that came to mind, I forget which speaker it was yesterday, but the whole idea of that my observation is that the younger workforce is looking for individuals, not necessarily the organization or the court any longer. I mean, that's what they strive for. So I think some of the reward we can give them for the number of them, when I look around in the room here that have been around for a while, is they want to be a sponge and get whatever they can out of you. They want to learn from you. They want to see you as the model. And I just suggest that in itself is a reward for them, because they may not plan on even being around for 10 years or whatever. So I just wanted to point that out, because I found those kind of rewards you have to do it. Why? Because there's people that do appreciate that, but not a lot of them. That's not their hot button anymore.
What a great 2 points. Let me spend a lot of time on that, because this is really important. Remember, we talked a little earlier about how that demographic bubble is hitting all of our courts now. And we need to look at what motivates the people that are coming in. Let me share some really positive news with you. Finally, I give you some positive news. One of my few private sector clients spends hundreds of thousands of dollars each year trying to figure out what pushes that demographics button. And here's the good news. We, as courts, are sitting on the very gold mine that they're looking for. And you know what that gold mine is? That age group from like 18, 19, 20 to about early 30s, they are motivated by making a difference. Why do you think Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Nike, every advertisement you see that goes for that demographic says, oh, by the way, you buy this pair of shoes and we're going to give $5 to save the rainforest? I'm making that up. Because the research says that. And your point goes exactly to what we were talking about earlier. The very values that they believe in, making a difference, community, and being individualistic,
Right.
to be able to do as an individual and feel like they are making the difference, has everything to do with what we talked about this morning. Talking about who we are first as an institution, why people come here every single day because of us, not because they want to watch the Super Bowl. Just reiterating what that is. So when you recruit, you say, this is who we are, this is what we're about, and this is a difference we make in concrete ways. You want to be part of it? The other thing that their research shows is that these folks, not all, but a large percentage of them would rather take less salary if they know individually they are making a difference than making a much larger salary and not being acknowledged.
We were just having kind of an education meeting with the county the other day, and we were talking about what to do with the newer generations. And a suggestion I made was we're in the perfect time right now. Courts are moving more into technology. personally, with maybe a number of my colleagues, aren't as adept at the technology that we're moving into. But here are these young generations coming in that like grew up since kindergarten with technology. We could tap into them, ask them to teach us those skills, and get them engaged by flipping who's mentoring who. You know, in certain situations, I think it could be a win-win on both sides.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good point. Thank you.
One challenge I've had with some of the younger staff that we've employed and very much promoting and competencies and leadership when we hire, they also want to make it their own. So we're trying to find that balance of, you know, making sure we give them the history. You know, there's certain, say, you know, like in our custody process, there are certain policies and procedures that are essential that judges have approved, so you can't make it your own and change that. We're trying to find that balance of letting them be a part and contribute and feel like they're, you know, making a difference, but not crossing those boundaries.
How do you do that? How have you successfully walked that tightrope, if I may ask? I'm not putting you on the spot, but.
Well, with the recent staff, we thought that we're getting a little off kilter and changes were being made, and I've done a performance improvement plan, and
You've done a performance improvement plan?
a performance improvement plan where we've said this is the expectation, and these are some areas that we've noticed some areas for improvement, and then what the action plan is. So if they were making something their own and changing policy, the expectation would be to learn the history, to understand, you know, the mandates or statutes and where we had some problems, and then give us new ideas, but come to leadership first to check them out, and so that type of thing.
I think that's very practical. Give them parameters, but don't confine them. Yeah. It is. It is. This is good. Other comments? Yes.
I have a question with respect to the slide before was talking about embracing the resistors, and yet that now your first bullet up here is get rid of the obstacles. Are they not basically kind of the same?
Great question. No, they're in concert but different, and it's about chronology and temporal sequence. You want to embrace the resistance up front, early on. You got to flesh it out. But at some point, as I said earlier, at some point, you've got to get rid of the cancer. Give them opportunities to resist, openly disagree. But at some point, I don't think courts do a very good job of this. At some point, you just got to say, Mary, I need you on board on this. If you can't get on board, we've got to find another place for you, or go to HR and work something out. And that's where it gets, as she was saying, it gets very tricky.
What happens if the resistors are the judges or a judge?
Okay, just forget everything what I said.
That's a very real.
It is. It is actually, I'm actually working with that issue right now, and what we have done is gotten other senior leadership judges that's having a safer conversation, saying, here's how it benefits you and also the community. And you can do this. And we're going to give you the support to do it, I promise. And some of the biggest resistors I've seen are judges, and I've seen them come around. Yes, Steve?
This is a question for the group. Are you seeing that the judges are collaborating more recently with the budget troubles and the issues coming up? In our county, in our district, I'm seeing a lot more involvement, a lot more collaboration than I think we've seen in a long, long time. And I'm wondering if that's a trend statewide, nationally.
What have you all observed in that regard?
Well, if you want to hear about California, no, it's completely divided, the bench in California. We have a group that wants everything to go back to the way it was during the Muni days. Everything's gone wrong since we've unified. Everything's gone wrong since it's central budget. And then we've got the other faction that are pulling together to try to support the branch. And what's that's created in our state, in my opinion again, is the legislature looking at us like we're a dysfunctional family, so we're not getting any funding. They're thinking they can't get their own house together, so, and it's created a real uproar. So on top of everything that we're all facing economically with the budgets and that kind of thing, this adds a whole another level to what's going on there. And of course, it's creating insecurities across the board, which I think is, and I, I've been in court administration 38 years, and I said the one thing, I thought I had seen almost it all, and right now, for me, that's the most disconcerting, because in the past, we always have pulled together. And I've never seen benches when one of their colleagues is out there hanging out to dry that they didn't band together and try to help that individual or whatever. And for the first time, I am seeing factions of the bench officers that now let them hang them out to dry and let them go. Which and when I say that, though, I'm not being as critical of the bench officers as you'd think, because they are facing, I think, for one of the first times, many of the fears that we have faced over time and time again and have dealt with. And now they're having to deal with it because it's actually touching their jobs, their environments, and what they can do. And they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel necessarily. So that's just what I have experienced in California anyway, Steve.
And with regard to collaboration, and I want to hear from you, we want to hear from you in just a second. I think California is an anomaly right now, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah, it's
y'all. It's a huge country.
Right. It is. What I'm seeing in what I'm seeing is much more collaboration between judges, and I think that has to do with younger demographics. But
well, what Steve's referring to was very strategic at Hennepin County. We, through Shelley's efforts and then Judge Kevin Burke's efforts, we started a new judge orientation program about, 10, 12 years ago. And because our bench now has changed at least 50%, we brought these judges in and incorporated as much about an organizational sense into their head early on. We were incredibly supportive to them. We showed them what administration can do. We defined how important it is for a chief judge to pick presiding judges in the respective divisions that care about an organizational focus. And that's what we've evolved into now, is you're starting to see that we have a presiding judge job description that supports what they need to do to support the organization and take their individual hat off and put their organizational hat on. So it's been strategic, but if you have enough rotation in your judges and you start with that program, it can happen.
okay, good observations. Was that responsive to you, Steve? Any other comments or observations? That's good. Very good points. Very good points. I want to have anybody else want to have last say on this before we move on? All right, let's look at what I think is the number one reason for teams to be able to make the transition in times of change. It's because we don't understand that the way we are born cognitively, we're born with preferences innately. How we see the world, how we decide. Do we want closure and command and structure, or do we want to be open-ended? Are we born extroverted or introverted? I'm going to spend a little time about this because Carl Jung, he is the foundation upon which the Myers-Briggs personality indicator was based on. It's the Jungian theory of who we are and how we go through life with preferences. I'd like everybody just to put their hands together like this for a second. Notice which thumb is on top. Take your hands apart. Now put them back together, but with the other thumb on top. How's that feel? Some people say it's fine, other people go, oh, it feels weird. If your preference, you don't even aware of, but your preference is, at least with me, I always put my right thumb on top. But I guarantee you, if I practice every day putting my left thumb on top, it would feel just as fine and natural. So when we talk about cognitive preferences, it doesn't mean that it's a matter of kind. It's really a matter of degree. And so let's talk about what Jungian theory is and how it impacts us and our ability to make change. And what obstacle gets in the way, because it's an invisible obstacle that often manifests itself in either a positive halo bias or negative bias, because we walk out of a meeting and people are watching completely different movies and we just can't understand why. There's a reason why. And if we understand the reason, then it takes the masks off of just some of these invisible problems that we have with core communication, collaboration. If you look at the very first page of your handout, if you have this, Young looked at 4 scales. We're not going to talk about all of them because we don't have enough time, because of your great questions and dialogue, and I mean that. I'd rather have that than anything. We're not going to talk about the extroversion, introversion, though it does have an impact. But the second scale that Young and Myers-Briggs measure is the intuitive versus sensors. Intuitives being called N's. We've already devoted the letter I to introversion, so we have to use N in Myers-Briggs parlance to intuitives. It's the second scale, how we prefer to take in and process information. Perhaps more than any of the other letters, this impacts your ability to have change or be dysfunction in trying to make change. And here's what I mean. If you'll turn to the next page, intuitives, well, you have to actually go, we're skipping, so go to the sensing judge versus the intuitive judge. I'm using judges as an example because I've got specific statistics on that. S's, we call sensing folks in the courts S's for sensing. Their preference is to be grounded in the actual, the present. They're called sensing or sensors because if they can't use their senses or their past experience that they've actually concretely experienced, they don't trust it. They don't prefer to use it in how they see the world, how they process and make sense of the information or the data, whether it has to do with a court change, transformation, or just the way they see the world. They are detailed. They see every tree in the forest. They don't necessarily see that it's a forest, but they see all the detail. That's their preference. They only trust what they can sense or what they've done. When you have a sensing manager, they are much more likely to be uncomfortable with or resist change because change is not something they've experienced. They are okay with change and change initiatives as long as they can apply protocols and solutions that they've used before. Unfortunately, with these changes, some of these solutions and protocols from the past don't apply to these new challenges. So S's are detailed. They rarely make a factual error. They're based in the present. They don't prefer to look forward. They want the as-is. They want to do what they've done. Their focus and glory is doing it the same thing over and over and over, but doing it better every time. Intuitives, on the other hand, N's, are just the opposite. Their preference is to see the meaning behind all the data, to see that, okay, all these thousands of trees, what's the meaning? It makes a forest. I see the pattern. I see the implications for our decisions, for our change initiatives. They are often factually in error because they are not very detailed. They prefer to find the meaning behind the data rather than to focus on the data itself. And here's the implication for what we're talking about this morning. N's, much more than S's, are always thinking in the future. They're looking at opportunity. They're looking at how to change. They're looking at different policies. And they are generally the change drivers in a court. Because they see opportunity. They say, okay, well, this clock works well. It ain't broke, but if we can make it work better or can find a completely new use for it, let's do it. Which makes S's cringe. So this goes to one of the hearts of this invisible bias where N's will see S's as just blatant obstructors, and that forms a bias against them even though they have just as a legitimate perspective as the intuitives do. Interestingly enough, I'm going to make this very concrete for you so you believe me. Trial judges tend, by overwhelming, much more than the general population, tend to be S's. So do court administrators. What a shocker. But when you look at the appellate judges in state courts, a much higher percentage of intuitives. Now, based on what I just said, why do you think that is? Because appellate judges, their preference is to look at the future and the implications of the decisions, not just what the minutia or the detail is. They self-select. It's not by accident. So when you are, as an N, or in a change, or you're required to lead a change or even part of a change, here are my suggestions to you. Simplify your message. N's tend to talk in terms of abstractions. They need to simplify the message, especially if we're going to get people to lead and follow us. We've got that. Most of the folks in our courts are S's, so we want them to understand what our message is. And when I say simplify, I don't mean dumb down. These letters don't predict intelligence or ability in any way. There's no better letter. They're just different preferences. But the best way to simplify our message is to give examples when explaining why and what difference this is going to make to the court and the people we serve in concrete ways. Give examples. Take notes. We forget detail. Details drive courts. It is a detail-driven institution, even when we're making change. If you're an N or high N especially, take notes, pay attention to the details. You can be seen as an impractical rebel who breaks the rules, 2 S's. But just understand that. So your job as an N to say, no, I'm not breaking the rules. What I'm doing is I'm taking the values and the core virtue and functions of this court, and I'm improving it. And here's how. Let me give you examples. So those are intuitives. If you're an S, and if you didn't take that, that's fine. How many of you are S's in here? How many of you are N's? Holy smoke.
The entire 25% is sitting right here.
I was going to say that is really, I think, I'd be interested to see what the second group is this afternoon. Maybe we just got all the N's in here. All the N's in here for this. But if you're a sensing manager, look behind the data for meaning. And this is important because to get people on board, we've got to create meaning for them. We've got to create meaning for the contribution to society, to the folks that we work with, that we serve. We've got to make it meaningful. The data does not inspire most people, except for S's. Here's one of the most practical suggestions I can give you if you're an S. Ask the question, why? What's the reasoning? Now, why do I ask you to ask the question, why? Because it makes the S open the universe to the bigger picture. The why is the one question that is the biggest question, with the lack of blinders on either side of all the questions that we can ask. So it makes you go to the big picture. What's the reasoning and why are we doing it? Don't get bogged down in details. You know, any type of change initiative is just full, especially technological initiatives, are just full and fraught of millions of details. Because S's love to live in the detail and in the present, they can become overwhelmed with these change initiatives because they can't command all the details. N's are great with it. They go, okay, I get it. This is the pattern. This is the meaning behind the data. Let's make a decision on this, and this is why we're going to go for it. Don't get bogged down in the details. Listen to hunches. True story. Who remembers when it wasn't Karpov, it was Kasparov, the great Russian chess champion. IBM said, we'll pay you $100,000 to sit down and play on live what we think is the most perfect thinking machine in the world. It's our computer. We call it Big Blue. It's a chess machine, and it is the perfect logical thinking machine that cannot be defeated. And we want to show it can outthink you. Now, this was like 20 years ago, okay? This was a big deal back then. Kasparov sat down and he said, okay, I'll do it. He lost the first match. So IBM was going, hey, great, wonderful. Let's go, cameras off, let's celebrate. And Kasparov goes, wait a minute. I want to play it again, just for fun. They go, okay. It's just more ammunition for us. He played it to a draw. He played it a third time and beat it. And then in the teleconference, Kasparov was an odd duck, but they asked him, how were you able to beat a machine that can think 1,000 moves ahead with an over 99% probability of winning? How is that possible? How did you beat it? He gave a one-word answer. Does anybody remember what it was? Intuition. I saw how it preferred to think. I intuited how to beat it. S's, listen to your intuition. Practice it. Practice putting your other thumb on top. You can get just as comfortable with it. And don't look at N's as being less credible. This goes to the issue of bias, that hidden saboteur of court team relations. S's and N's tend to look at each other like, well, they're not credible, or they're just a stick in the muds. They don't know that's the movie going on, but don't view them as being less credible. Any questions on that? Let me close talking about J's versus P's, judges versus perceivers. I don't like the nomenclature that Myers-Briggs uses when they use the word judging, because it's not judgmental. It has nothing to do with judgmental. Jung said this dichotomy between, he called them different things than what Myers-Briggs did, between judges and perceivers is this. J's, high J's especially, have a high need for control and structure and closure. They love checklists. My law school roommate, who's now, he's probably past a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, every night he would make a checklist. The very first thing on his top of his list every night, and I saw it on his dresser almost every night, was get up. J's, there's an insatiable desire for control. Not only for control in their own lives, but control in systems and at work. And they want that structure and rules. Rules govern. And you don't break the rules. And you're not late. You're timely. You're ahead of time. Deadlines to J's are exactly that. They're deadlines. And they will impose that deadline on you. To P's, they are just the opposite. They're open-ended. I call them P for procrastinators, but they have very little need for control and structure and command in their lives, and they have even less interest in imposing that on others that they work with or in the system that they work with. Deadlines to a P is just a reminder to get started. Because they don't need that structure. They don't need closure. They don't need command. That is so antithetical to the J's. When it comes to change initiatives, the P's tend to be the creative folks. Go, hey, think about this. Hey, let's go for a walk to the park and talk about this. J's are going, no, the meeting must conclude in 15 minutes and 30 seconds. And this is another invisible clash that we don't see play out in our teams when we're trying to initiate a major change. The J's are thinking, why aren't the P's on board? The P's are going, the J's are rushing through this. We need to think through it. And they're both can be right simultaneously. You know, I call J's, especially J judges in court administration, I say they're hamstrung by having J-lock. Because J's want to have control and structure and closure on whatever it is they're dealing with, they get J-lock. They form a preliminary strong hypothesis, and then everything after that, even if it dispels that preliminary hypothesis, they see in light to be consistent with that hypothesis, because they've got to have closure and control and structure. P's, on the other hand, are very good at testing out and saying, no, this direction we're going, it's wrong. We need to go back. It drives J's crazy. But often they will, you know, a P would rather take an extra year in the shipyard building the ship to make it didn't have any holes. A J will often say, we got a schedule to make and we're sending out now. It's exactly what happened with the Titanic. And we know how that story ended. So don't allow this invisible dynamic also bias you. The takeaway from this is appreciate that there are differences between the cognitive approaches that people prefer to use in your court teams. Not better or worse, but be able to spot them and operate them and operate on them. That will allow you to do a lot of the things that we talked about this morning. Have an open, trustful dialogue. Make sure that we can have a transforming court, that we can have change initiatives that can overcome fears if we have that dialogue, and that we can sometimes do more with less if we apply what we've heard today and the excellent comments that you all have made. Any comments before I'll let you go to the trough? Yes, please. Okay.
Say 44 for J. What does that mean?
All right. I'll give you a specific example. You scored a 1 on the T, on the thinking. That means you have, on a 1 to 100 scale, a very low preference for T. You're right in the middle between T and F. Okay. Now, I also see you have a 50 on the S. That means you're a fairly high S. You have a fairly strong preference for S.
So it's a scale of
1 to 1 on this test that you took. One of my new staff members I'm working with, I gave him this test. She scored a 98 on the J scale. And I said, oh boy. But now I know what I'm dealing with, and I'm not prejudiced. I just know she has a high degree of structure and control. And if you think I'm making this up, a perfect example, and I'll end it on this since we have about 3 minutes. I've only been with the Utah AOC for a few weeks, and one of the first things I came in, I looked at the teams, and I go, we've got to get away from these calendars, written calendars. We've got to go to this universal calendar so everybody knows where everybody and what they're going to do, so there's no conflicts. I thought this was a pretty benign thing, and it was like talking about guerrilla warfare. It was warfare right there. You're not taking my calendar, and you're not taking the big calendar that our admin has from us. We've got to have that. Going back to small wins, I arranged to have a 45-minute training for all the people at one time, and they picked it up in less than 20 minutes. And now they're going, thank God we're not doing that. But J's, that is talking about losing a sense of control. Taking my calendar, that's a threat. But I understood that, and we even talked about it. I go, I know you have a high need for control and structure. This is not going to take that away from you. This is actually going to give you more control, because now you can see at any moment what everybody else is doing and specifically where they are and what their commitment is. So you can actually have more control over your calendar. So, and that's one of the biases that, because I appreciated that, there was no bias, I hope, that injected itself in that dialogue. These kind of things will help us have some of the tough, difficult change management dialogues. Thanks for your time, folks. You've been very, very patient.